Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the launch of the SNP Manifesto for the 2019 general election. Now, these events are becoming quite a regular feature, which must be quite puzzling for people here in Scotland. 5 years ago, during the independence referendum, the leaders of the No campaign, made up, of course, of the Westminster parties, promised that if we voted no, we would get stability. But since then, the Westminster parties have delivered not stability, but constant chaos and 3 UK general elections. The promise that if we said no to independence, Scotland would stay in the EU has been broken and...
Lie number 1. You know, there's a reason that Nicola Thinlips was able to come away from the Question Time special last Friday smelling of roses in comparison to the rest. Because there's a completely alternate reality that Thinlips lives in. There's this completely fabricated version of events that Nicola Sturgeon runs with, and 9 times out of 10 she's able to do so completely unchallenged. And this is exactly point in case, as clear cut as it gets. She runs with this narrative that we were promised that staying in the UK in 2014 was the only way to remain in Europe, completely rewriting history, and as well as that, she's now made it seem as though the 2014 referendum was all about the European Union. It's a lie. I don't understand why I have to keep repeating myself. Well, I do, because myself and everybody like me, smaller or larger, channel-wise, is battling never-ending censorship. But the point remains the same. The only lie that I remember from 2014 is the fact that the SNP tried to make out for the best part of 2013 and 2014 that voting to leave the UK meant we would be able to inherit the EU's membership. And after some time, they were forced to admit that it was absolute bullshit. Then they released a white paper that specifically stated that in the event of independence, they would try to re-enter negotiations to try and get back into Europe. Not set in stone, but the point remains the same. If you were to suggest to them that voting for independence in 2014 meant that we would be outside of the EU, they'd be quick to point to you their white paper. So by that logic, and the alternative, which would have been remaining in the UK, stands to reason that both outcomes potentially could have led to Scotland staying in the EU. Second of all, it was made well aware that there was potentially an EU referendum on the cards if David Cameron was re-elected, as he made it crystal clear that that would be what would occur if he was to be re-elected. And he said this months before the SNP's referendum on independence ever came to fruition. You know, Nicola Sturgeon is no different at all to any of these politicians down in Westminster like Joe Swinson and Corbyn and all these staunch Remainers who are pathetic, treacherous politicians who do not understand the meaning of the word democracy. But Nicola Sturgeon is rather sly in the way she goes about it. She gets to hide behind the mask, the facade of sticking up for the people of Scotland. She's simply only doing what she's doing because she's looking out for the will of the Scottish people. But let's not forget how that came to be to begin with. She specifically told independent supporters to vote to remain if they wanted independence at some point in the future. Then, when the referendum result came around, 62% of Scotland, ever since then, she's made a habit of telling people that in order to remain in the EU, we now need independence. A complete shifting of the narrative. 62% of Scotland didn't vote to remain in the EU because they wanted to remain in the EU. I reckon a big bulk of them voted that way because of exactly what she said. Another point that gets left out from Thinlip's little diatribe.
Broken spectacularly.
And if that was the case, why would Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond campaign to leave the UK in 2014? Why would they do that?
That it was just a scare story to suggest that Boris Johnson could be Prime Minister has been broken.
As if anybody would have known that that was to be the case. Come on, fuck.
And the promise that Scotland would be treated as an equal partner in the United Kingdom has not just been broken, but completely shattered.
Because you made one compromise that was rejected. That one compromise that's turned into multiple compromises with each and every speech that takes place.
The reality of Westminster control over Scotland is this. A right-wing Tory government Scotland did not vote for.
And the alternative is a left-wing globalist shill.
Prime Minister in Boris Johnson, who is dangerous.
Oh, and you're not.
And unfit for office. Tory cuts to the Scottish budget.
Doesn't stop you pumping money into Malawians' army though, you thin-lipped boot.
Our National Health Service under threat.
Oh, you've done a good job of destroying that yourself.
From a Tory-Trump trade deal.
It's devolved.
A power grab on the Scottish Parliament. Children forced into poverty.
Doesn't stop you pumping money into LGBT and refugee and migrant organisations, or feminist organisations, or anti-racist organisations, or the Malawians on aforementioned. You know.
And a disastrous Brexit deal that will hit jobs, living standards and workers' rights. But there is worse to come. Because unless Boris Johnson is stopped, this will just be the start. Brexit is nowhere near being done. The Tories have barely got going. They haven't even started trade talks yet. Because of Johnson's hardline position, there is every chance that the UK will leave the EU without a trade deal next year. That would be a catastrophe for jobs. And even if he somehow avoids that, his dream deal will be a nightmare for Scotland. It will take Scotland out of the single market, which is 8 times the size of the UK.
She keeps saying it's 8 times bigger, but we don't exploit that 8 times bigger single market. We trade more with the UK than we do with the EU, so it doesn't really matter how big the European Union's single fucking market is. Just because it's bigger in size, it's irrelevant.
Alone, and out of the customs union, the world's biggest trading bloc. Compared with EU membership, that could cut Scotland's national income by around £9 billion by the end of the next decade. That is equivalent to £1,600 for every person in...
What do you think's going... What do people think the revenue loss will be when we phase out oil and gas in favour of this fantasy future where we make all of our money from renewables?
Scotland. Environmental standards and workers' rights will be at risk. And as night follows day, the Tories will sell out Scotland's fishing industry.
Remind me again who it is that has been completely trouncing the Scottish fishing industry up until this point. I mean, there's a meeting, an annual meeting, which is soon to occur again this year in December, to discuss quotas in the North Sea. In our own waters, we're having to discuss quota systems. Oh, but it's the Tories. Of course it's fucking Tories.
The SNP, Scotland's Remain party, backs a new UK-wide referendum on EU membership.
Yeah.
Jeremy Corbyn, incredibly, says that he is neutral on the issue of leave or remain.
It shouldn't really matter which way you fall on the question. The fact of the matter is there's been a referendum, and the fact that you can't respect that referendum result makes you no different to these other politicians down south, as I've already said. That the SNP's clever little trick is they get to hide behind this concept of the people of Scotland. They're simply following what the people of Scotland want. And nobody seems to realise that they have coerced you into voting a specific way. They have coerced you in a direction which they can exploit.
That means he is neutral on job losses, cuts to living standards.
And what the does she think none of these things would occur from getting quote-unquote independence from the UK?
And of course, he would be happy to sit back and see Scotland taken out of the EU, even if there is a majority for Remain in Scotland, but
how did that majority come to be, Nicola? Why don't you tell the public? Why don't you tell the people that are conducting your interviews, why don't you tell the cameras currently, in your face, just how that majority came to be in the first place? If you're voting with independence in mind, the only sensible and logical vote is one to remain in the EU. A vote to leave would mean the premise for independence doesn't arise. Why independent supporters should vote remain this Thursday? Ring any bells, you thin-lipped boot?
In the UK as a whole. The truth is that Brexit will dominate Westminster politics for years and years to come.
Exactly why Nicola Sturgeon is trying to get a referendum. Because time is running out on her mandate. 2021 will roll round, completely refreshing their mandate, as well as potentially ousting them, which I doubt, but there's always the threat of that occurring. They've stated themselves that even in the event of a second EU referendum with Remain winning, that wouldn't settle it, they claim. They reckon that Brexit wouldn't just die a death there and then. Oh no, no, no. And of course, because of that threat, because of Brexit supposedly looming in the background in those events, in that outcome, that's enough to justify trying to get a referendum. That's enough to justify a second independence referendum. And it's independence in name only. Why has independence all of a sudden become about EU membership?
So this election really, really matters. The future of Scotland is on the line. The opportunities for this and for future generations are at stake. We must not let Brexit rob our children's future.
We're not having children, Sturgeon. Record low birth rates that you've done nothing to fix, rectify or even look into. What children? What, you mean the immigrant children?
It means the kind of country we want Scotland to be.
You mean you?
Is on the ballot paper. And at the heart of it all, I ask people in Scotland to consider this simple but fundamental question before you cast your vote. Who should decide Scotland's future?
You have a mandate that specifically stated if there was circumstantial and material change, such as being taken out of the European Union against our will, that would grant you the right to a referendum. And the fact that you've spent 3 years trying to prevent the UK leaving the EU, and in doing so, you have left yourself literally no time left in order to be able to act upon said mandate. You're now trying to twist it, shift the goalposts, and separate the the prospect of a second referendum from the mandate, making it as if, regardless of whether or not Brexit occurs, you have the right to a referendum all of a sudden. You've separated the two issues, but you've completely twisted and contorted reality to try and appeal to as much voters as possible by this illusion of Scotland having a right to determine its own future. It's up to us to determine our own future. Completely negating the fact, of course, that you've spent 3 years, you and your cronies, the same as the rest of the pricks down at Westminster, trying to stop Brexit. And because you have been relatively unsuccessful up until this point, you're now trying to fall back to your plan B. You're now trying to fall back and exploit the voters in Scotland, fall back and exploit their desire for independence. And of course, if this was really about Scotland having a right to choose its own future, why the fuck has Nicola Sturgeon chosen for you? What would happen to Scotland in the event of independence? Where's the second referendum to decide whether or not we go back into Europe? Huh? People need to wisen up.
The people who live here, or Boris Johnson. I vote for the SNP.
The people that live here, and of course, the people that live here is anybody now. Because there's no such thing as native Scots, according to Nicola Sturgeon.
On December the 12th is a vote to escape Brexit.
Is it? What happens if a Tory majority gets in? What happens then?
It is a vote to put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands.
Is it? What happens if the Tories get in? You're resting a hell of a lot on a permission slip.
And crucially, it is a vote to deprive Boris Johnson's Conservative Party of a majority.
And bear in mind, they have now decided to run with the narrative of depriving the Tories of a majority. They've dropped the Stop Brexit routine because they saw how the Lib Dems were losing support for just that. So they've now decided to run with a narrative of depriving the Tories of a majority. But what do you think depriving the Tories of a majority does? Stops Brexit, potentially. And that's what they want to do.
You know, in this election, The SNP is the challenger to the Tories in every single seat that they hold. So the reality is this: in Scotland, only a vote for the SNP can defeat the Tories. By voting SNP, we can lock the Tories out of office.
And stop Brexit. And of course, in those sort of circumstances where they're able to lock the Tories out of government, potentially that would presumably mean that they would go into some form of partnership with the Labour Party, and the Labour Party will inevitably give them their second referendum. So of course nobody will be any the wiser that up until this point she's been fleecing them.
But we can do that only by voting SNP on December the 12th.
Yes, and give this thin-lipped fucker the power that she craves.